Hey nerdy knitters! In this video we're going to look at some knitting patterns for sideways triangle shawls. Now these triangle shawls are knit from tip to tip in two different ways. The first 5 use a basic structure of increasing and decreasing along one edge to create the triangle. And the next 5 take this tip to tip shape and completely change it by working increases on both edges, but then a decrease along the middle to get that center spine. And you've probably seen some of these patterns because it's a really popular construction method. All of these patterns can be found on Lovecrafts, and you'll find links to each of them down below in the video description box. Now before we jump in, I just want to say hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a knitwear designer and a certified knitting instructor, and my goal is to help you become a confident, adventurous knitter. Now let's take a quick look at how these tip-to-tip shawls are created. Here's our first little swatch. You start at one tip and you increase along just one edge. I increased every other right side row on this one. Then when you get as wide or as deep as you want your shawl to be, you start decreasing down to the other end. So it's called a tip-to-tip triangle shawl. That's the basic construction, but you can also really change that up and do this type. It starts out the same up at this edge. You're working increases along both sides, but you're also working a decrease down the middle, which gives us the interesting shape. Now, I'll link a video at the end that will show you exactly how to work these types of shawls if you're interested in seeing more about the construction. But now let's look at those 5 patterns that follow this tip-to-tip construction. Now, if you're looking for something simple that you can do while you watch TV or listen to an audiobook, this first one's a good one to start with. The Early Winter Shawl by Laura Ayler. It's worked in garter stitch, so you're knitting every row, but there's also some eyelets in there for a little bit of a change, and some color blocking, which makes it a nice graphic design. Now, one thing that's really popular with this tip-to-tip construction is to work the main body of the shawl in something simple like garter stitch or stockinette, but then include enough stitches to work a border along the edge that's increased and decreased. And in there you could do something like lace or cable design, and this next shawl does exactly that. The Kyna by Lucy Haig, the body of the shawl is knit in stockinette. Then it also has a twisted cable border that's worked in a background of garter stitch. You can see how that border is completely integrated into the shawl. It's worked at the same time. So you have the cable panel along one edge and the main body of the shawl is simply worked in stockinette. Now the next shawl also has a cable along the border, but this time there's a cable along the top edge and the bottom edge, and the center has some interesting designs going on as well. The Milena by Lisa Haynes. You can see the cables along the top and the bottom edges, and then there's also a slip stitch design going on along the center, worked on a background of garter stitch, so those slip stitches really stand out. The next one, Semele by Asa Tricosa, also uses this added border along the top and the bottom, but this time it's worked in lace. You can see there's lace edgings worked along both the top and the bottom, and the main body of the shawl is worked in stockinette. Now this last shawl in our first 5 is Kirra by Amba O'Brien. This one is an all-over slip stitch mosaic pattern, so we've got some color going on here. Now if you're new to colorwork knitting, mosaic and slip stitch knitting is a good introduction because you're only ever using one color at a time. You use one color in the row and you slip the other color that you're not using, and that creates the pattern. And when you finish with that color, it's usually every 2 rows, you would drop it, pick up the other color, and work the next 2 rows knitting with that new color and slipping the other stitches to maintain the design. Now before we get to the next 5, why don't you leave me a comment and tell me about your favorite patterns that are knit tip to tip. This tip to tip design can be used and changed in a multiple of ways, and one really common way is to work those increases along both edges and then also introduce a decrease along the center that creates sort of a spine. And it's not hard to work once you understand the basic construction. At the end, I'll link a video that shows you exactly how to work that. Now let's look at our 5 shawls that use this construction. The first one on my list is Rift by Laura Ayler. Now this one's worked in garter stitch, so if this is a new construction method for you and you're a bit nervous, this would be a good one to start with. But it does have a little interest with those small bands of color. As you can see here, she uses a nice high contrast of it's worked in just a stark white and then some bold colors added in there. Now if you really love the fading technique and you've got lots of yarn, you'll want to try the Find Your Fade by Andrea Mowry. This is a big shawl that uses lots of beautiful colors. It's worked in garter stitch, so it's still really simple. You're following the basic construction. increase along the edges and that central decrease in the middle. There's also some eyelets in there, and of course, all of the beautiful colors from the fading technique. Now, if you don't want to use lots of different colors, but you still want some color in there, you could try a gradient yarn with this next pattern from Amba O'Brien, the Myndie shawl. It's worked in garter stitch, but it also has some simple eyelets for some added interest. If you're looking for something that focuses more on texture instead of color, the next one might be for you, the Nasha shawl from Craft Doodling. It still uses garter stitch as its base, but there's also some interesting lace designs and eyelets in there as well. Last on the list is another one by Andrea Mowry, Birds of a Feather. This one uses mohair and some beautiful hand-dyed yarn and some lace panels as well, but it's still quite simple to work with a beautiful shawl as the finished result. I knit one of those myself using some fun colors here. Now, it's a really long shawl, but it's not very deep, so it's really nice to wrap around your neck on a cozy day. And there we have it, 5 shawls that follow that basic tip-to-tip method, but still provide beautiful results, and 5 more that use that interesting construction. If you want to learn more about these construction methods, I've linked a video here that you can check out. It will teach you everything you need to know about this type of tip-to-tip sideways triangle shawl. Be sure to leave a comment if you have a pattern recommendation or an interesting tip to share about this construction method, and be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting.